I'm kind of embarrassed to tell you all this, but I really didn't know until basically the last couple days what exposure compensation really is and really does. So when I say I didn't know about exposure compensation, I truly mean I didn't know how it worked on my camera, and I really never paid much attention to it, honestly. So I shoot on the Canon EOS R and also on the Canon EOS R6, and both of these cameras have exposure compensation available to the camera, as most DSLRs and maybe not most DSLRs, but a lot of DSLRs and certainly new mirrorless cameras, they do have it available to you on your cameras. Since this was a new year, I wanted to come clean, and I also wanted to learn some things. So I really wanted to understand how exposure compensation can help me and my photography, or perhaps help you in your photography. Now, I might have a bit of a built-in excuse on why I didn't really understand exposure compensation, and that's because I mainly shoot in manual mode. Now, in manual mode on the Canon EOS R and the R6, basically it will not be available to you if you're shooting in manual. It's usually available in the automatic settings, such as aperture priority or shutter priority or things of that nature, or even program mode. But that being said, there's no excuse for me not knowing what exposure compensation does for my camera and my photos and how it works on my particular camera. So how it works is your camera has an internal meter that basically sets your exposure to about 18% gray. Not something you really need to get into, but the idea is that your camera is going to reflect light back into the sensor at about, and it's going to try to keep everything at 18% gray in terms of, like, if something is bright, it's going to try to adjust to that brightness, and if it's something that's really dark, it's going to try to adjust to the darkness. That's only going to happen with the light that's actually coming in to the sensor. So what that means for your camera, if you're shooting in program mode or aperture priority or some type of automatic mode, is that your exposure compensation is going to move either to the dark side or the light side of that metering system in terms of basically 1-point stops. Or you can set it, I believe, in your camera to be a third of a stop or things of that nature, but you'd have to look to your particular camera to figure that one out. Let's talk about a couple situations. For example, I'm somewhat backlit. You know, it's off to the side here, but let's just say if I was completely backlit and the sun was right behind me, or there was a bright light or some type of light source right behind me, essentially exposure compensation is going to go towards the positive side of the metering system to provide you a little bit more light onto the subject. And that makes sense because you would kind of be underexposed here as the subject. And the opposite is true for the negative side of the exposure compensation metering system. It allows you to darken the subject when you have too much light, perhaps, on the subject. Now you might be asking yourself, hey Pablo, why don't you just change your exposure within your ISO or your shutter speed or your aperture instead of using exposure compensation? That's a great question. I actually had the same exact question. What I just found out and what I didn't know about exposure compensation is that when you do utilize it, it essentially doesn't change any of your other settings. So if you have something locked in for aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, essentially it's just going to brighten or darken the scene as you wish and not change any of those settings. And I think that's pretty key. It's kind of like putting an ND filter on your lens to darken an image, or in certain cases you can lighten it from going to, let's say, a 6-stop to a 10-stop, which would darken it, or from a 5-stop down to a 1-stop, which would lighten it. So it's kind of an internal ND filter, but not so much. We're not going to get into that, but it kind of acts like one, just a little bit. So ultimately you get to save your creative settings within your camera, such as motion blur when you're talking about shutter speed. So if you don't want to change that and you love the motion blur that's happening within your camera, just use exposure compensation to change the exposure and it won't affect that. Same goes with aperture. If you like the depth of field that you have already set in your camera, that's a creative choice, and you don't want to change that by adding more light or darkening the scene and changing that shutter speed, or excuse me, the aperture. So in that case, exposure compensation might be the trick or the thing that you use out in the field for some of your photography. So for you Canon shooters, I did find out that you can utilize exposure compensation within manual mode if you're shooting manual, completely manual, and that's by changing the one setting when you're in manual to auto ISO, and then you will see the exposure compensation there and available for you. I wrote down some of the pros and cons for using exposure compensation. One pro might be that it's a quick fix for exposure errors. You're not always going to get it 100% if you're in kind of a run and gun situation or you're in a time crunch, let's say. And so having exposure compensation there as a backup to try to balance your shot out, I think that's a good thing. It's definitely a convenience when you're shooting in a semi-automatic mode, such as aperture priority or shutter priority or things of that nature, because you're going to be able to salvage or keep the settings that you want, your creative settings, and not change any of those, and then be able to change the light a little bit with exposure compensation. And lastly, it's beginner friendly, especially if you're just starting to learn about photography and shoot in an automatic or semi-automatic mode. Exposure compensation can give you that bump and adjustment that you just might need with your photos. Look at me, I'm an experienced photographer and really rarely ever used it, only because I was ignorant to it and I mainly was shooting in manual mode. So whether you're a beginner or you're a professional photographer and you've never really used exposure compensation, it just might be time to check it out. Some cons for shooting in exposure compensation. One could be that it's limited to certain shooting modes. For me, it's a con because I rarely utilized it because I'm mainly shooting in manual, and I wanted to shoot in manual for a long time. So that means I haven't really had an opportunity unless I obviously go to the ISO auto mode, and it's not something I usually choose to do. I like to shoot in the lowest ISO I can, but that doesn't mean that I won't use it in the future. Now, another con may be that you forget to reset exposure compensation, because if you set it to, obviously, let's say you want it to be a little bit darker in your scene, then that's fine, but then you'll have to reset it for the next shot. So that can be a little cumbersome and get in your way. But if you're not in any hurry, it might be well worth it. And the last one that could be considered a con is full reliance on the metering system. Essentially, you want to be the last call on every shot that you take. And of course, you want a little bump in the support department. So, exposure compensation could certainly help you with that. And so I do say utilize it whenever you want, or if you've never tried it, go and try it and tell me what you think. So let me know down in the comments below if you utilize exposure compensation in your day-to-day, or let me know if you're gonna try it. And if you do, leave a comment down below and let me know how it turned out. All right, till the next one, I love y'all. Peace.